Welcome to the Dachau concentration camp memorial. This is the location used by the Nazis between 1933 and 1945 for a concentration camp. This place that you now see so empty is normally full of visitors. In fact, thousands of people come every day to visit the memorial. Why do so many people come and visit a place which is actually quite ugly and very, very sad? Why do we all feel the need for a memorial here? Well, first of all, the memorial wants to honor the memory of those who suffered here, those who died here. Secondly, it wants to give the historical evidence of what happened, because there have been people who denied it or denied the extent to which it happened, and unfortunately there still are such deniers. Thirdly, this place is a reminder that we should not take democracies for granted. In fact, Germany had been a democracy between 1919 and 1932. The Nazi Party managed to get into a coalition government legally in January 1933. And once in power, Hitler was able to dismantle democratic institutions very ruthlessly and very rapidly. Fourthly, and most remarkably, this place reminds us of what human beings can do to other human beings. And we want this never ever to happen again anywhere. It's not just a German problem, we don't want it to happen anywhere. But in order to prevent it from happening again, we do have to take some time in trying to understand how this was possible. In fact, this happened not so long ago in the heart of Europe, and Germany had reached levels of excellency in many fields like philosophy, music, art, literature and science. Yet here we were able to degenerate to such an appalling extent. How is this possible? Well, the concentration camp of Dachau is particularly useful in trying to understand the Nazi dictatorship for three reasons. First of all, it's the longest lived camp, because it's among the very first to start up in 1933 and will be the last but one to be liberated in 1945. It is the only concentration camp operating throughout the 12 years of a dictatorship. Secondly, it was a model concentration camp, and that's because the second commandant, Theodor Eicke, but he became commandant already in July 1933, so very early on, he introduced a set of rules and regulations which was so detailed, so well done from a Nazi point of view, obviously not from ours, that Heinrich Himmler, who at the time was head of the Bavarian police and of the SS, he decided that all concentration camps should implement this set of rules and regulations and should operate the way this camp was operating. Thirdly, this was a training camp for the SS. We all have heard the term SS. We know that they were a substantial part of the repression under the dictatorship. They had actually started operating already in the early 1920s, initially a small group presenting themselves as Hitler's bodyguards, but then they'll develop in a real army. In fact, they considered themselves political soldiers. This meant that the training would be very intense, as for soldiers, but the enemy they were training to fight was not a foreign army, but the inner German political enemy. So train hard to fight this kind of enemy. But they also considered themselves an elite, which means that not just anybody could become part of the SS. You would have to volunteer, but then you also had to qualify. You had to prove that you were suitable, therefore particularly fanatical. So these fanatical men, mainly young men, would be recruited and trained in places like this one to become even more fanatical and brutal. In fact, after the war, this place will be also referred to as the School of Violence. What is not so well known, though, is that with time in Germany they started running out of fanatical volunteers, so they start taking on more or less anybody, and in the second half of the Second World War there'll be SS men who are not German, but people recruited in the occupied territories. But all the people who went up in the hierarchy of the SS were German, with a few Austrian exceptions, and many of them were trained here in Dachau, like Rudolf Höss, who became commandant in Auschwitz, Josef Kramer, who became commandant in Bergen-Belsen, and others. Why was the concentration camp set up in this specific location? The answer is given by those buildings behind me. They were part of a gunpowder and munition factory operating here between 1915 and 1919. In 1919, with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was obliged to disarm, therefore reduce its army to a minimum and stop any military production. So this factory was obviously shut down. The 8,000 workers that had been working here were dismissed. The area was abandoned for several years, but it was perfect for the SS to transform into a concentration camp because it had the barracks where the workers had lodged. It had workshops, sewage pipes, water pipes, and a railway line. Plus, you don't build a gunpowder factory in the middle of an inhabited area. It wouldn't be very wise. In fact, at the time, the town of Dachau was much smaller than it is now, so it was further away, so that the SS were far enough from people to do what they wanted, but at the same time, they were strategically close to Munich, which was very active politically at the time, so many prisoners to bring here. Now, the three main factors that enabled the Nazis to take power were economic instability, prejudice against Jews, but also other social groups, and nationalism. And unfortunately, these three factors did not disappear in 1945, but on the contrary, in the last few years, have been on the rise in many parts of the world. So we have to bear this in mind. And 5 years ago, a survivor during the celebration for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp had said to me that the hope of the survivors with the memorial was that future generations would learn from all this suffering in order to make it a better world. This is the message we have to keep in our hearts.